Picture this moment. You've just finished explaining your reasoning to someone who questioned your decision. Your explanation was clear, logical, and delivered without defensiveness. You covered every angle, addressed their concerns, and laid out your thinking step by step. The conversation ended politely. No raised voices, no conflict, no drama. But something shifted. You can feel it in the air between you. The respect you expected to gain from your thoughtful explanation never materialized. If anything, the dynamic feels different now, less equal. You explained yourself perfectly, yet somehow you're standing on lower ground than when the conversation began. This isn't about communication failure, this is about something far more subtle happening beneath the surface of reasonable discourse. From childhood, we learned that explanation equals maturity. When we were young and made mistakes, adults would ask us to explain our actions. The ability to articulate our reasoning was praised as growth, as emotional intelligence, as taking responsibility. We internalized a simple equation. Good people explain themselves when questioned. This conditioning runs deep. Explaining feels like fairness in action. It demonstrates that we're not arbitrary or impulsive. It shows we've thought things through, we respect the other person enough to share our internal process. When someone questions our choices, explaining feels like the emotionally intelligent response. Thoughtful people default to explanation because it aligns with their values. They believe in transparency, in helping others understand, in building bridges through communication. They assume that clarity will lead to mutual understanding, and mutual understanding will restore harmony. The more considerate and self-aware someone is, the more likely they are to reach for explanation when their judgment is questioned. This impulse feels not just reasonable but virtuous. Explaining yourself appears to be the mature alternative to defensiveness, the collaborative alternative to conflict, the intelligent alternative to silence. But explanation does something unexpected to the structure of an interaction. When you explain yourself in response to questioning, you unconsciously accept a particular framing of the situation. You position yourself as someone whose choices require justification. The person questioning you becomes the evaluator, and you become the evaluated. This reframing happens without announcement or agreement. One moment you're two people with different perspectives. The next moment, one of you is providing evidence and the other is weighing its merit. The shift is so subtle that both parties might miss it entirely, yet it fundamentally alters the power dynamic between you. Consider what happens when someone questions your decision and you respond with explanation. You're not just sharing information. You're implicitly agreeing that their questioning was legitimate, that your choice was indeed questionable, and that you owe them a justification. The burden of proof quietly transfers from them to you. This transfer happens regardless of whether the questioning was reasonable. It happens regardless of whether you actually owe anyone an explanation. It happens simply because you provided one. The act of explaining, no matter how calmly or confidently delivered, signals that you accept the premise that your judgment is up for review. The questioner doesn't have to argue for their right to question you. They don't have to justify why your decision concerns them or why their approval matters. By explaining, you've already granted them the authority to evaluate your choices. You've moved from equal footing to a position where you're seeking their understanding, their acceptance, their validation of your reasoning. The mechanics of this shift operate through the implicit rules of conversation. When someone poses a question about your choices, they're making a claim about the legitimacy of their inquiry. When you respond with explanation rather than questioning their premise, you validate that claim. You confirm that their curiosity or concern warrants your detailed response. This validation extends beyond the immediate interaction. Each time you explain yourself to the same person, you reinforce their authority to question you. You establish a precedent that their confusion or discomfort with your choices creates an obligation for you to provide clarity. The relationship gradually reorganizes around this expectation. The burden of proof doesn't just shift, it becomes permanently assigned. The questioner learns that they can express doubt or confusion about your decisions and receive detailed justifications in return. They don't need to demonstrate why their opinion matters or why their understanding is necessary. Their questioning alone becomes sufficient to trigger your explanatory response. Meanwhile, you learn to anticipate their questions and prepare your justifications. Your decision-making process begins to include consideration of how you'll explain your choices to them. You start evaluating your options not just based on your own judgment, but based on how defensible they'll be under questioning. The mere possibility of having to explain begins to influence the choices themselves. This anticipatory dynamic reveals how thoroughly the authority structure has shifted. You're no longer simply making decisions and occasionally explaining them. You're making decisions with the implicit understanding that they may need to pass someone else's evaluation. The questioner's perspective becomes a factor in your decision-making process. even when they're not present. The shift becomes self-reinforcing because explanation creates the appearance of accountability without the formal structure of accountability. The questioner gains influence over your choices without taking responsibility for the outcomes. They can express concerns and receive detailed responses without having to justify their concerns or accept consequences for their input. You, meanwhile, take on the burden of justification without gaining the benefits of genuine collaboration. You provide transparency without receiving reciprocal transparency. You demonstrate respect for their perspective without receiving equivalent respect for your autonomy. The exchange becomes fundamentally unbalanced, though this imbalance remains largely invisible to both parties. Status operates through inference, not declaration. People don't announce their level of authority or respect. Instead, these qualities are communicated through patterns of interaction, through who defers to whom, through who seeks approval and who grants it. When you repeatedly explain yourself to the same person, you're creating a pattern. Each explanation reinforces the dynamic where they question and you justify. Over time, this pattern becomes the foundation of your relationship. They learn to see themselves as someone whose concerns warrant your detailed responses. You learn to see yourself as someone whose choices require their understanding. This erosion happens gradually and without confrontation. There are no arguments about respect or authority. No one explicitly claims higher status or assigns lower status. The shift occurs through the accumulation of small interactions where one person consistently takes the role of questioner and the other consistently takes the role of explainer. The person receiving your explanations doesn't have to be manipulative or calculating for this dynamic to develop. They might genuinely appreciate your transparency. They might value your thoughtfulness. But appreciation and respect are different things. Someone can appreciate your willingness to explain while simultaneously losing respect for your need to do so. Respect often correlates with certainty and self-possession. When you explain yourself repeatedly, you signal uncertainty about your own judgment. You demonstrate that external validation matters more to you than internal conviction. Even if your explanations are brilliant, the fact that you felt compelled to provide them suggests that you're not entirely confident in your position. This dynamic appears across all types of relationships, though it manifests differently in each context. In romantic partnerships, one person might find themselves constantly explaining their social choices, their spending decisions, or their time management. The explanations start as consideration for their partner's feelings, but gradually become expected justifications for ordinary autonomy. The explaining partner believes they're being transparent and collaborative. The questioning partner might genuinely think they're just trying to understand. Neither recognizes that they're establishing a pattern where one person's choices are subject to the other's ongoing review. The relationship slowly reorganizes around this dynamic, with one person in the position of making decisions and the other in the position of evaluating them. Family relationships often follow similar patterns. An adult child might find themselves explaining their career choices, their living situation, or their lifestyle decisions to parents who express concern or confusion. The explanations feel respectful, like honoring the family relationship, but over time, the adult child remains in a childlike position of seeking parental approval for adult decisions. The parents might not intend to maintain authority over their adult child's choices. They might simply be expressing interest or care. But when their questions consistently receive detailed explanations, they learn that their concerns carry weight in their child's decision-making process. The adult child learns that their choices aren't fully legitimate until they've been explained and understood by their parents. Workplace dynamics reveal this pattern with particular clarity. An employee might find themselves explaining their methods, their priorities, or their time allocation to colleagues who question their approach. The explanations demonstrate professionalism and collaboration. They show respect for team input and commitment to transparency. But when one person consistently explains their work choices to others who don't reciprocate, a hierarchy emerges. The explainer becomes accountable to the questioners. Their judgment becomes subject to ongoing peer review. Even if they have formal authority, they gradually cede practical authority through the pattern of explanation and evaluation. Thoughtful people are particularly vulnerable to this dynamic because they operate from assumptions that make explanation feel necessary and appropriate. They assume good faith in others' questioning. They believe that understanding leads to harmony. They prefer clarity to ambiguity and resolution to tension. These are admirable qualities, but they create blind spots. When someone questions your choices, thoughtful people assume the questioning comes from a genuine desire to understand rather than a conscious or unconscious attempt to establish authority. They focus on providing clarity rather than examining why clarity is being demanded. Thoughtful people also tend to be uncomfortable with conflict and tension. When someone expresses confusion or concern about their choices, explanation feels like the path to resolution. It promises to clear up misunderstandings and restore smooth relations. The alternative, not explaining, feels unnecessarily difficult and potentially harmful to the relationship. This discomfort with unresolved tension makes thoughtful people willing to invest significant energy in explanation. They'll spend time crafting detailed responses to questions that might not deserve detailed responses. They'll prioritize the other person's understanding over their own autonomy. They'll choose harmony over boundaries. There's also a connection between this pattern and the broader tendency of thoughtful people to withdraw when relationships become consistently draining. The person who explains themselves repeatedly often eventually stops engaging altogether. They move from over-explanation to under-communication, from seeking understanding to avoiding interaction entirely. The failure of explanation isn't a moral failure or a communication failure. It's a structural failure. Explanation operates on the assumption that understanding leads to respect, but this assumption doesn't account for how the act of explaining itself affects the dynamic between people. When you explain yourself, you're not just conveying information. You're participating in a particular type of interaction with specific implications for status and authority. The content of your explanation might be perfect, but the context of explanation shapes how that content is received and what it communicates about your position in the relationship. This isn't about the intentions of the people involved. The person questioning you might have no desire to diminish your status. You might have no intention of ceding authority. But intentions don't control the effects of repeated patterns. The dynamic develops through the structure of the interactions, not through anyone's conscious design. The recognition itself matters because it changes how the interaction is interpreted. When explanation is no longer seen as neutral communication, the pattern becomes visible, not as a conflict, not as a moral failure, but as a structural shift that repeats over time. What once felt like clarity begins to register as evaluation. What once felt like openness begins to look like justification. The same behavior carries a different meaning once the pattern is understood. In that sense, explanation doesn't fail because it lacks precision or sincerity. It fails because of how it positions the person offering it. The structure of the exchange does the work, regardless of intention. When choices are repeatedly explained, they stop standing on their own. They become provisional, subject to review, dependent on acceptance. Seen this way, explanation isn't inherently good or bad. It's contextual. And in certain patterns, its cost isn't immediate conflict. It's the quiet reordering of status that happens without anyone